speaker, Travis Perusich.
Yeah.
Great. Travis Perusich.
Not many people get it the first, like right off the first time.
He's a PhD candidate at the University of Arkansas, our only grad student presenting today. He was a little nervous. I told him that's okay. We're friends. We're all friends here. And we were all grad students once and presenting at conferences. He's working on a dissertation on the role of African American soldiers during and after the American Revolution, and he's here to talk to us about the Declaration of Independence and Black freedom today. Travis?
Thank you, Dr. Margaret. All righty. So it's been great hearing all of you with your great presentations. I'll just jump into it. So one of Thomas Jefferson's proudest achievements in life was authoring the Declaration of Independence. It was the foremost thing on his epitaph, and he kept a copy of the Declaration of Independence at Monticello on display into old age. But specifically, the original draft, scored and scratched like a schoolboy's exercise. Indeed, Jefferson believed this was the only correct version of the document, as the official declaration adopted by the Second Continental Congress endured dozens of revisions. To Jefferson, the most loathsome of these revisions concerned his excoriation of King George over the slave trade, as well as a more explicit excoriation of Lord Dunmore's proclamation in the first year of the War for Independence. Especially for those in the Lower South, restrictions on slavery and the fear of slave rebellion were among their primary reasons for the war. As such, an attack on the slave trade would have been anathema for Southerners. Consequently, this section was cut to appease the South. The cut portion reads, in part, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty which he has deprived them of, and murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people, with crimes he urges them to commit against the lives of another." The Declaration of Independence, with this cut section, reveals much of the goings-on concerning the sentiment, how revolutionary ideology and white concepts of freedom were to be reconciled with black unfreedom, as well as the military implications of black service. This war, increasingly defined by ideology, reified by the Declaration, introduced a faction of persons, black soldiers, that had a decidedly different interpretation of that ideology than did Jefferson and other white Americans of the day. However, due to the circumstances of the war and differing interpretations of that ideological influence, black service became a regular part of both the Patriot and British forces. Soldiers of both armies being driven in part by notions contained in the Declaration. Black soldiers saw the Declaration of Independence as a tool by which they might secure their own freedom, in direct contrast to the predominant notions of white ideologues like Jefferson, who saw blacks as necessarily excluded from the grant of freedom that America enjoyed. Indeed, with this passage, one can view the original draft in the light of historians such as Edmund Morgan, who argued for the inverse relationship between white liberty and black slavery. Jefferson was explicitly articulating a case for white Anglo-American freedom, with no meaningful intention of pursuing black freedom. On the contrary, he was actively opposed to the acts of black freedom that resulted from Dunmore's proclamation, labeling them as crimes. However, in putting pen to paper and placing, quote, before mankind the common sense of the subject, as he would write to Henry Lee late in life, Jefferson reified these concepts of liberty and made them available for a different interpretation. In keeping with Morgan's words, when they dissolved their connection, they opened the doors to freedom wider than they realized at the time. Black soldiers became major agents of this figurative door of freedom being pushed open. During the war, black soldiers used ideology from the Declaration to secure freedom from slavery, or otherwise fought with the hope of promoting black rights based on said ideology. Meanwhile, beyond soldiering, blacks of other trades applied the Declaration and the war to the cause of black rights. Black poet Phyllis Wheatley used the Declaration's ideology to show the hypocrisy of fighting a war for freedom while maintaining black slavery in her poetry. After the war, black abolitionists used the Declaration to attack institutional slavery as a whole, while black veterans used it to personally advocate for their own rights as veterans. With the war and the Declaration of Independence, black soldiers, veterans, and other agents stood at the intersection of discussions of white and black conceptualizations of liberty. They used the ideology of the Declaration that was necessarily intended to serve white ends to meet black needs. Pardon me while I get a drink of water. The most direct military reference comes from the "rise in arms" quote, Jefferson's jab at black soldiering on behalf of the British. On November 7, 1775, Virginia's royal governor, John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, known as Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation in the wake of the Patriot Rebellion. He proclaimed, "I do hereby farther declare all intended servants, Negroes or others, free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops, offering a place for African Americans and freeing those who were enslaved in exchange for service to the Crown." Dunmore had made the British synonymous with black freedom, while also making manifest one of the greatest fears of Southern slavers like Jefferson. To this end, a major departure involved in these differing interpretations of liberty and freedom reified in the Declaration is that the ideology drove most black soldiers to fight for the British. Consequently, in the cut passage, we necessarily see Jefferson not speaking in terms of ideology with regard to armed blacks, but, as Judith Van Buskirk articulates, in terms of threat and ruin. Again, Jefferson's condemnation evidences Morgan's theme of promoting Anglo-American freedom at the expense of black unfreedom. Jefferson is happy to condemn as criminal the motivation of those black soldiers fighting for Dunmore. As Nash asserts, the revolutionary generation's problem was not in its conception of universal rights as expressed in the Declaration, but rather its inability to honor them. Despite Jefferson's proclivity, the fact that most soldiers of the War for Independence fought against rather for the patriot cause, remains a well-established fact in the modern understanding of the numbers, although recent findings do suggest the numbers are less lopsided than was once believed. Although dated, or perhaps even supplanted by historians like Nash, Benjamin Quarles perhaps put it best. Black soldiers' major loyalty was to a principle. Insofar as he had freedom of choice, he was likely to join the side that made him the quickest and best offer in terms of those unalienable rights of which Mr. Jefferson had spoken. Whoever invoked the image of liberty, be he American or British, could count on a ready response from the blacks. The Declaration's principles were driving black soldiers, but not necessarily towards the patriot cause. The common sense Jefferson articulated was interpreted differently among those with a different commonality. Despite this, however, blacks still found inspiration from the Declaration to serve the patriot cause in the thousands as well. For example, in 1780 in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, John and Paul Cuff, two free local blacks, refused to pay their taxes because they could not vote. As such, they felt their rights of no taxation without representation were being violated. In so doing, they invoked black service in the defense of their position. We apprehend ourselves to be aggrieved in that while we are not allowed no vote or influence in the election of those that tax us, yet many of our color, as is well known, have cheerfully entered the battle in defense of the common cause, and that as we conceive against a similar exertion of power. As historian of black loyalists Allen Gilbert asserts, this petition shows why at least 5,000 blacks fought to extend the liberties spelled out in the Declaration of Independence. The more recent numbers suggest that number is as high as about 9,000 across land and sea forces. Meanwhile, future free black abolitionist and veteran of the Navy, James Forten, would hear a reading of the Declaration of Independence as a child and devote himself entirely to the cause for the duration of the war, despite becoming a prisoner of war at one point. Of course, the Declaration presented a contradiction between the interests of white and black freedom. One who was not happy to ignore these contradictions was an African-American veteran and future abolitionist, Lemuel Haynes. Born and raised in New England, Haynes spent his youth as an indentured servant, pursuing a career in the church. When the War for Independence broke out, he joined the cause in the Massachusetts militia. His military service was limited, being a participant during the siege of Boston, then largely on active garrison duty at Fort Ticonderoga in the early years of the war. However, Haynes' experience in the war and revolution proved consequential to his future advocacy for black rights. As one of his biographers, historian John Salient describes, his service as a soldier in the Continental Army was brief, but he absorbed from the American Revolution a mix of Republican ideology and new divinity theology that inspired his anti-slavery and pro-black writings. This took specific shape through his ministry and political writings, where he used his position to not simply advocate for abolition, but actual equality, while vigorously opposing the colonization movement that would gain popularity in the early 19th century. Haynes harnessed the ideals of liberty he encountered while serving in the War for Independence, and in the years following his service, fervently argued for black equality. Black men, he articulated, had already demonstrated their civic virtue by supporting the patriot cause in the Revolution, as well as by participating in the economic and religious life of the U.S. Late in life, he would reminisce fondly that he devoted all for the sake of freedom and independence and endured frequent campaigns in their defense and has never viewed the sacrifice too great. But this belies the activism he engaged in early on. During the war, while actively serving, he made it a point to leverage revolutionary ideology to advocate for black rights from an early date with his essay, Liberty Further Extended, or Free Thoughts on the Illegality of Slave Keeping. Written shortly after the passage of the Declaration of Independence as a rebuttal, Haynes chastised the hypocrisy of the Declaration espousing liberty while slavery still prevailed. He asserted, "It cannot be thought impertinent for us candidly to reflect on our own conduct, and I doubt not but that we shall find that subsisting in the midst of us, that may with propriety be styled oppression, nay, much greater oppression than that which Englishmen seem so much to spurn at. I mean an oppression which they themselves impose upon others." Haynes was compelled through his experience serving the cause in the war and driven by the conviction of the ideals reified by the Declaration of Independence and a desire to ensure that an African American had an equally as good right to his liberty as white Americans. Haynes uniquely asserted that, in the words of Salant, an egalitarian Republican society was to be forged in America. Haynes would eventually use his platform as the nation's first ordained black minister, combined with his service, to leverage his ministry and the legacy of the Declaration of Independence in a necessarily political manner throughout his life as an abolitionist. His earliest biographer and contemporary, Timothy Cooley, articulates it best when he asserts, "A mind like his, which had been imbued with the spirit of the American Revolution, could not easily rest in neutrality." In keeping with the profound inspiration black soldiers and veterans like Haynes drew from the Declaration of Independence, the historiography actually interprets the American Revolution itself, and more specifically, black service therein, as a black Declaration of Independence. According to Benjamin Quarles, the adverse and often hostile conditions freed and enslaved blacks encountered during the Revolution, quote, did not deter blacks from pressing for the Revolution's goals of freedom and equality. In fine, the Revolutionary War can be termed a black Declaration of Independence in the sense it spurred black Americans to seek freedom and equality, end quote. The sentiment is echoed by more contemporary scholars like Judith Van Buskirk. She articulates how the Revolution emboldened blacks, in particular, black veterans, to bring their cause to the light. The Revolution played an important role in that change, standing in their own light, went from being a charge worthy of punishment to a Declaration of Independence. Meanwhile, other pillars of the field, like Gary Nash, offer similar allusions to the Declaration in his writings. Nash describes some black soldiers as making their own personal Declaration of Independence. He also describes how black Americans fought with a willingness to die for unalienable rights against odds even greater than those faced by white revolutionaries. To this end, we see as a result of the Revolution bringing about this black Declaration of Independence, blacks became their own best advocates and often found soldiering to be their best solution. Nero Brewster and his fellow New Hampshire slaves evidenced as much when they appeared before the New Hampshire legislature in 1779 and pleaded, "We fondly hope that the eye of pity and the heart of justice may commiserate our situation and put us upon the equality of free men and give us an opportunity of evincing to the world our love of freedom by exerting ourselves in her cause and opposing the efforts of tyranny and oppression over the country in which we ourselves have been so injuriously enslaved." Nero's ultimate fate is unknown, But he did end up enlisting in the New Hampshire line for some time at least. We do know that. In another case, historian David Hackett Fisher relates the story of Felix Cuff, who after returning home from the war to Waltham, Massachusetts in 1780, had his master attempt to re-enslave him. Cuff would have none of it and insisted he was free. After resisting, evading, in a brief altercation, Cuff was eventually cleared and granted his freedom with the support of most of the town behind the decision. Emboldened by fighting in the war, Cuff asserted himself as few black men would or even could have prior to the Declaration of Independence. Cases as this evidence the notion of this Black Declaration of Independence that emboldened the black community and black soldiers in particular to advocate for themselves in unprecedented ways by leveraging the ideology reified by the Declaration of Independence. Within this greater environment of the revolution as a Black Declaration of Independence, but beyond the actual soldiering, this intersection of black and white perspectives on the war manifested itself in other ways. In particular, in the form of the poetry of famed black poet Phyllis Wheatley. Having been educated from a young age, Wheatley was enslaved until 1773 when she was emancipated following her first published collection of poems. She subsequently rose to prominence in the Revolution with her poem To His Excellency George Washington, which would earn her a meeting with General Washington in March 1776. Already in her early works, Wheatley was incorporating the revolutionary ideology of the age, quote, freedom's cause. However, in the wake of the passage of the Declaration of Independence, we see Wheatley leveraging her ability to communicate to both white and black interpretations of freedom so as to advocate for black freedom to white audiences. This is best exemplified in her 1778 poem on the death of General Wooster. You can see it, the snippet that I'll read you up there. Addressing the poem to Wooster's widow, she lauds his martyrdom by beginning, "From this muse rich consolation draws, he nobly perished in his country's cause that ever fired his mind, where martial flames and Christian virtues joined." However, and note the specific intentional, his virtues, his martyrdom, his country, the intentional emphasis on this white interpretation of freedom. However, as the poem proceeds, she transitions her topic to the war and then the case of black freedom. She continues, "Columbia, through the toils of war, with thine own hand conduct them and defend, and bring the dreadful contest to an end. But oh, how presumptuous shall we hope to find divine acceptance with the almighty mind, while yet, O deed, O generous, they disgrace and hold in bondage Africa's blameless race. Let virtue reign, and those that court our prayers, be victory ours and generous freedom theirs." Wheatley used the Declaration's ideology to address the dichotomies of freedom occurring in the moment. On the one hand, she acknowledged and spoke to the wartime sacrifices of white soldiers like General Wooster. But with the invigoration of the black community due to the Declaration, we now see Wheatley using her poetry to highlight the hypocrisy of fighting a war for white freedom while maintaining black unfreedom. The poetry of Wheatley is indicative of far more than her presence within the environment of the Black Declaration of Independence. Her poetry is but one example that shows the Declaration and the ideology it reified inspired the black community for years to come. As Ira Berlin asserts, many owed their liberty to the changes unleashed during the Age of Revolution, and they shared the optimism that accompanied that independence. This can be seen in examples such as Richard Allen. Richard Allen is that gentleman on your left. Richard Allen is the one that is obviously not Frederick Douglass. After receiving his freedom in the early years of the war due to his master being compelled that slavery was wrong, Allen assisted the Patriot cause as a wagoner. As Allen's biographer, Richard Newman, asserts, the war between the American colonies and Britain reverberated in many ways, establishing liberty as the American lingua franca. Allen would go on to fight discrimination and use his position as a founder of the African American Episcopal Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, to promote black freedom and rights. He incorporated the inherent contradictions of slavery with the Declaration throughout his life and made himself such a prolific abolitionist, Frederick Douglass would refer to him as the architect of a new Declaration of Independence. Last paragraph. There are, of course, innumerable examples beyond that show how the Declaration of Independence was wielded by blacks during and after the War for Independence. Black soldiering, but also black poetry, and eventually advocacy for black rights through black ministry wielded the Declaration and black service during the War for Independence in order to challenge slavery and black inequality in ways it had never been tried before. By leveraging white Americans' interpretation of their own rights against them in pursuit of black justice, black Americans seized these forces for their own ends. This sometimes meant using poetry to speak black issues to white audiences. It meant using reified Declaration ideology to advocate for legal advancement in the form of emancipation and greater access to rights. It also meant actively opposing the Patriot cause at times, as freedom for black soldiers meant taking the better deal for freedom for black people. Taken together, we see how the Declaration of Independence helped the black community usher in a black Declaration of Independence for present and future black Americans to use for their personal and black communal advancement.